Welcome to Not Another CEO podcast. I'm your host, David Politis. Every week, we talk to inspiring leaders and get the true stories, the ups and downs, the lessons learned, and come away with actionable advice for our own journeys. Today's guest is an entrepreneur, thought leader, investor. She was part of an early group of entrepreneurs that really put enterprise tech on the map in New York City. She's the author of The New Rules of Workbook, a best-selling book on how to navigate your career in the ever-changing workplace. For over 12 years, she ran a business that helped millions of people navigate the job market. She's been busy recently, traveling the world, investing in companies and Broadway shows, and it sounds like she may be working on her next thing. Please welcome co-founder and former CEO at The Muse, Kathryn Minshew. Hey, Kathryn.
Hey, it's really good to be here.
I'm very excited. I've been waiting for this conversation for a while. You are the first exited founder that we've had that isn't operating at the moment. So I think we have a lot of different places to take this conversation.
Definitely.
Okay, let's first, right out of the gate, what is one thing that you did at The Muse, big or small, that had the biggest impact and you'll absolutely do again if you're CEO of another company in the future?
Being comfortable not being liked or having all of your decisions liked and agreed with. I think when I first started The Muse, we were a small team. There was a lot of consensus. We were really mission oriented. But as the company scales, the business gets more complicated, the team gets bigger, and suddenly I, as CEO, had access to a lot of information that not everybody had. Sometimes they couldn't know it, or in one case, even legally, we were prohibited from talking about terms of a deal. And all of a sudden, everybody has an opinion about the decisions you make. And there was a period of time at the beginning where I found that to be a bit crippling. Once I got over it and realized that you can't make everybody happy, you have to act in line with your own principles and with high integrity. But whether people like your decision or not, that's not something you can control. It was really freeing. It was a really important part of becoming a better CEO.
One other CEO that we talked to, they said that for them it was about being unapologetic. They felt like that was the thing where, and I have gone through similar. I think it's a personality thing of like, who are you as a person? There are some CEOs, I think we know them, who don't care, like really don't care about how they're viewed or if people like them or whatever. And I think if there's a personality probably like you, probably like me, that you want people to want to follow you and enjoy being at the company, and and you can almost make it, I don't know, maybe too much of a democracy, when you're in that mode. And at least for me, I think when you're a first time founder, it's probably maybe even worse that you're leaning towards that.
Completely. I had an exec pull me aside at one point and say, please just make the decision. People would rather be frustrated at you because you didn't pick the choice they wanted than either have to make that choice themselves or stay in this in between with no choice. And it was actually clarifying. He was giving me permission to pick one, commit to it, and move forward. And of course, sometimes you're wrong. So you've got to be really open to that feedback. Sometimes there's a solution that either can't satisfy every team, every department, or there's data that not everyone knows. So there was a point early in the Muse's life where we had the opportunity to make an amazing deal, hugely beneficial for the company. And we got it at a unbelievably attractive price, but on the condition legally that it was confidential. This is fairly common. And somehow a rumor started that we had paid $1 million for whatever. Anyway, it's a longer story, but there was a lot of whispering. And while I did address it head on and say, look, the rumors aren't true, I also was not able. I even actually went to the other party in the contract and said, could I share XYZ? And they were like, no. So there are times when you just have to accept that not everyone's going to be happy. And I think, again, for someone that really cares about others, ultimately, I do want people to be happy. Sometimes for me, it was also as simple as having the direct conversation. I remember actually reading a parenting book that my brother recommended. I don't have kids, but my brother has an amazing daughter, and he recommended a parenting book that had this strategy: two things are true. And it was about how to talk to kids. But I remember once an executive came and they were frustrated about a decision I made. And for whatever reason, I had just read that chapter in the book. I was like, I think two things are true here. You would have made a different decision. You're frustrated about the decision I made. And I can't change the decision. I'm standing by it. And they were like, well, thank you for saying that I'm frustrated. I just really wanted you to know I don't think that was the call that I would have made. And I was like, I hear that. It was a really hard decision. I fully respect that. And thank you for sharing your opinion. And, it sounds, I don't know, it sounds silly in a way. Now I'm repeating it now, but it actually diffused a lot of the situation, just letting them be angry and accepting that that was okay.
What I find when you say that about the executive, one of the things that I think about is stories and experiences that I had where really strong executives, people I trusted a lot, would challenge me on these things and same answer, hey, I have to make a decision. This is my decision. And actually, for a couple of them, it kept escalating where those conversations got more and more contentious. And at one point, I actually said to one of them, I'm not even saying your decision is wrong and mine is right, but I am the CEO and I have to be the one to make a decision. I'm the one who has to live with it ultimately. And I told him, I said, you need to go and be a CEO because you actually, it feels like you're at that point. And I've had a number of people who worked with me and worked for me who have gone on to do that. And everyone, no exaggeration, will call me within 6 months and say, that conversation, I now understand what you're saying.
What's so funny is as you started telling this story, I was thinking of three different people that I had this exact situation, or have come and found me later and say, it is so much harder and so different being in the seat and making the calls than I realized. I'm so sorry. In one case, I had somebody be like, I am so sorry. I was such a pain in your ass. And I was like, look, you had a position, you believed in it. Like I loved the way that you advocated for it. And at the end of the day, not everybody gets to make the decision. And I think that's one of the things I also think is important about being a CEO is knowing when do you allow the discussion and the dissension, because it's vitally important to allow it for a period of time. I think it's very dangerous, and I would say I think it's a poor way to lead not to encourage and support people disagreeing with you, people raising challenges, people contradicting. And at some point, you sometimes also have to shut it down and say, now this is the decision. And we had a point in the Muse's life where we debated internally whether to become more of like a purely B2B SaaS product. We had essentially a marketplace with employers on one side, 20% of the Fortune 500 at our peak, and 70 million job seekers on the other. But there was an opportunity we had to potentially really go into deep B2B SaaS without any sort of consumer component. We debated it, frankly, probably for too long, but it was my first time as CEO. I really wanted to hear people out. And when I made the call, when we doubly committed to being a marketplace, we had an executive who would not get on board and just kept bringing up the other plan. And ultimately, I had to tell them that they either needed to get on board or leave the company. And I was like, look, if you want to, it's a bit similar. If you want to make this call, you can go be a CEO or found a company, but this is the company that I'm running today, and this is the call we're making, and we need people to get on board. And it was actually much easier to operate after that.
Do you think it's different because, or harder if you're a CEO who's a woman versus a man? Like, do you?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting. There's been a lot of research in academia, in a variety of business contexts, that people expect likability from women leaders in a way that they don't necessarily from men. And we can probably think of 20 examples in the pop culture. You can be a guy and I don't know, can I say like kind of a dick? But people will be like, oh, but he's so smart. He's decisive. We have all of these attributes that I think we sometimes allow men to be very complicated in ways that that women get really punished for. So yeah, I have this conversation, frankly, all the time with female founders, frankly, women execs in general, where they do feel like, I feel like there's a bit less tolerance of anything that seems, because I think culturally we often still want women to be really caring, really kind, really likable. I believe I'm all those things, but I also have to make hard calls to run a business. And yeah, people punish women more when when they perceive those things are in conflict, even though, as we've talked about, sometimes the company doesn't have all the information. Sometimes there are situations at a board level with investors, with a customer, sometimes legally, that only a very small group of people have access to. And it can be really hard when, you feel like every call is being judged, but that's also part of the job.
Do you really, over time, you became the face of the Muse, and you wrote one book or multiple books?
One big book, also a bunch of digital stuff. But yeah, one like Wall Street Journal, published, Penguin Random House, whole thing book.
And you were on TV all the time, and you're doing, like, was that for you natural? Was that something that you had to work on, get comfortable with, or was that natural for you?
I think the true answer is a mix of both. I don't believe that there's one way to be a good founder. In fact, I sort of hate whenever anybody publishes these lists of like, here's what this founder does and why you should do that too, because different businesses need different types of founders, and different people have different things that come easily. For me, when I was starting the Muse, one, we were a consumer business, so we had to find consumers. We didn't have a dime for advertising. And so I thought, well, where are the people we're trying to reach? They're consuming other media, they're on other platforms. So how can I get out there? And it wasn't just me at the beginning, but it turns out that I was pretty good at it and I enjoyed it. So I found that was like a really helpful strategy for our specific business for the B2C side. I also learned really quickly that a lot of the employers we were selling to, businesses of all sizes and shapes, but usually like a talent acquisition, HR, chief people officer, many of them were very skeptical of new businesses because they'd seen a lot of startups come and go. And so if they saw me on CNBC, whether, by the way, that was because they were tuning into CNBC or because my sales team sent a clip of me on CNBC as part of a sales email, if they saw me on CNBC, they were more likely to buy. They were more likely to open the email. The book was a really effective B2B marketing tool that we leveraged a couple of times to just establish legitimacy, tell people we have something to say, we're not going anywhere. And so, I was like an actor when I was a kid, high school, college. Like I love theater, did a little bit of directing too. Maybe that's the CEO side coming out. But I certainly didn't think that I would have made the media and the public brand of the Muse such a big part of my job. But it turned out to be one of the things that really helped us keep winning. And I think part of being a founder, especially like us, like we did not have an easy time raising funding. And so when some doors are closed, you got to find the ones that were open. And I could, you know, tell stories about the job search or write articles that would get published in Bloomberg. And that generated the momentum to then provide the business with a lot of the resources we needed.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I remember seeing your book in our office, and I think the recruiting team had it. And it's this, especially when it's a physical book. I mean, everyone does ebooks, but when it's a physical published book, like, that's a very different, that asset is at a different level.
Yeah. And what's interesting too, and I tell this sometime to a friend of mine that are thinking about writing a book. Well, so there's the pro and the con. The con is like writing a book took way more time and focus than I realized it would, even though I was writing about something that was what the Muse did. And, we were able to leverage a lot of the content on the Muse. But the plus side was a lot of people in corporate America were far more impressed that I had published this book than that I had built this whole company. And just to let it be clear, like I am 20 times as proud of the company as the book is great, but like building a company is really what I poured my heart into. It's what I loved. It was far harder. But for whatever reason, when we did the book, there were a number of people that were like, oh my gosh, you have a book. I would love to take a meeting with you. So, again, sometimes the world doesn't work the way you think it should. But if you figure out how it does and can kind of use that effectively to do the things you want to do, that's how I saw the book. And it was an adventure.
That's awesome. Let's talk a little bit about New York. I think the Muse was a big part, like I said in the intro, of the early days. We started our companies I think essentially the exact same time. And what what do you think, how was New York when we started our companies in your mind? Like what do you remember?
I mean, I love New York and I loved building a business in New York. I think it's different now, although I'm not on the ground in the same way. So maybe my data it isn't right. But when I first started the Muse, you could fit the entirety of New York tech into a single bar, and people did regularly. Um, we had this real sense of being the underdog. I went out to San Francisco for Y Combinator. We were accepted into the winter 2012 batch, which is a whole nother story. And a lot of people were like, oh, you'll never move back. San Francisco, you should be based there. Look, San Francisco has a great network. There were a lot of brilliant people. There's clearly, especially at the time, there was more money. But San Francisco doesn't need another winner. And I felt like New York, people were rooting for each other. They were like supporting each other. There was this incredible sense of camaraderie that I think comes with at the time being a bit of an underdog. And when we finished Y Combinator, it was pretty straightforward decision to move back a couple months later. I just, it was sometimes harder to find experienced talent. I think that's gotten a lot better. They're just more people with more reps. We moved people to the city from other places because we were looking for startup specific expertise. And we actually had to build a lot of that because there weren't as many people that had it. I'm guessing you saw some of the same things.
Yeah, I mean there was not no one had. I
No
mean at the
one.
time almost no one.
Yeah. Unless you were doing, like a fashion company or finance, everybody else either had to learn the experience or you had to bring them from someone else. But you know what? People also love New York. So we moved a lot of great folks here. Some of them are still here. Some people, saw it as like a 3, 4, 5 year tour of duty and now they live somewhere else. But um, I think that I don't know, this city is full of people that are just trying to make their mark on the world. And I think the sense of community that the tech industry had, like I really loved. And also I'll add it was much more diverse. I mean, I would go to events in San Francisco and people were like, "Oh, sorry, which PR company are you with? Whose assistant are you?" Like New York was not amazing in the early days for being a female founder, but it was like it was 10 times better. At least in New York, most people that I met in tech had like a female boss at some point in time. Because especially again 2011, 2012, 2013, I can't tell you how many guys, and I've become good friends with them, and then at some point they'd open up and be like, I've literally never worked for a woman. Some of them had never had a female professor because of what they majored in. Like it just, I felt like, and I think again, I think it's getting better, but yeah, it was a more challenging place as well to be a bit different from the norm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember we met at that workbench dinner and it was me, you, Olivier from Datadog. There was like that crew of 8 people, and I think that was 2013, 2014. And it to your point, I feel like we were really the under. I mean, everyone I would talk to in New York, they were in finance or they were at a big law firm or something like that. But when I told people I did tech, they said tech. What exactly? And now it's different. Now I think it definitely is different. It feels like it's grown up a lot here, and I don't feel the same. It's not the same level of underdog because now there's so much funding here over the years, and but that was a special period of time. I think for New York enterprise tech, like the New York tech meetup. I remember I went to it and it was hundreds of people, and then you'd go to the New York enterprise tech meetup and there were a dozen people, maybe. You know,
Totally. Well, and what was also cool about the really early days is it hadn't been established yet in kind of culture that startups were a viable path. So all of us individually were probably still being told by some of our friends and family, like, "Sorry, you're doing what? You're starting a business?" And now I think that's the other big change is like we've had so many kind of big success stories that you also get like a lot of people that come into startups because they think it's their fastest path to making money, which it can be, but I do feel like the early folks were like, we were all a little crazy in the way that I tend to really like.
Yeah, yeah. No, and it was, and there was a lot of support, for each other. And I think now it's
Mm.
feeling like almost, I feel like what has to happen in the community is even more segmentation to get into smaller cohorts of very particular enterprise tech cut up even more,
Yeah.
because I think it's powerful when you have those small groups, and you almost, you can really open up. You can also hold each other accountable, and so yeah, I in many ways I miss those days.
Maybe we'll find a way to bring it back.
Yeah,
You and
yeah.
me. Let's go.
Well, I mean, I had an investor. I actually forgot this until just now. Very well known investor. I won't name them. That I went to pitch them in San Francisco, and they told me, "We'll invest if you and your team move to San Francisco."
I heard that too.
I said, I have to move here?" They said, "Well, how are you going to build an enterprise tech company in New York?" And I went back to my angel investors. I said, "They gave us basically a term sheet as long as I move, but I don't want to move. This is why I came back to New York, was to build a company here." And they said, "Well, that, we're probably going to get that a couple times." And that was a big, anyway. So I think that was, the investors were even saying that. And in California, like, how are you going to build a business in New York? That doesn't even, you have to be here.
Yeah. And proved them wrong.
So let's talk maybe a little bit about your team, because you really built up your team over time, and you started, I think, with two other co-founders. But over time you really built up your executive team. Was there a point in time where you realized you needed people from outside, like executives who had experience, and that they could come in and bring that experience to the table? Or was that just a natural evolution? Was there like a tipping point?
There definitely was a tipping point. In retrospect, we should have brought in experience sooner, to match with a lot of the um, homegrown ideas and passion we had. So the story of the Muse, when I first started the business, like you said, two co-founders, we recruited an early team in the first 6 months, but we had no money, or very, very first no money, then very, very little money. So everybody was incredibly mission oriented, and we just didn't have that much to pay. I was taking nothing for the first year, and then I think I paid myself 40K a year living in Manhattan. So that was special. But anyway, we had this like super passionate, but because of the constraints on the business, nobody working on the company in the early days had the top job anywhere else before. There was a lot of folks that were like just trying, and we had a great team. I think we accomplished like unbelievable things for the resources we had. Again, starting something out of nothing, it. But then the challenge came when we started to scale. Now, it took us 4.5 years to raise a Series A, because a lot of investors did not believe in the concept. I think it was still, New York was a hard place to raise. Being a female founder who's not an engineer was incredibly brutal. I had a lot of people tell me that I should get a male co-founder, or various kind of. We also served a majority female audience for a jobs product, which led to a lot of, people saying things out loud that now they'd probably recognize they should keep to themselves. But things like, aren't all your users going to leave the workforce once they, turn 30? And, it's like, women have jobs, actually. Oh, yeah. Like probably 10 different people said versions of that. And people said all sorts of crazy things. Again, I think even though 2011, 2012, 2013, it's not that long ago, but in terms of, I think, our kind of awareness about social dynamics, about gender, we've come a really long way. So yeah, I mean, it was a fascinating time. I got turned down 148 times during the seed round, but we finally closed it, and the business started to take off. And part of that Series A was because we had, I think, 2 million people a month using the Muse, completely organic. We didn't, again, we didn't spend money on marketing. So like 1.5 million or 2 million people per month using the Muse, unique people. And then we had our first year of $1 million in employer revenue, and that tipped us over to our Series A. All of a sudden, we raised $10 million, which was a huge Series A at that point in time. And we started scaling. And the first year was beautiful. Like it was like putting gas in the tank of a car that you'd been like pushing by manual force down the highway. Like we just took off. We blew past every milestone. Our board was thrilled. We were thrilled. It was like, it was magic. And then as we got bigger, both the board wanted us to scale faster and faster. They started to think, maybe this was the next unicorn. We had a year where we grew top line revenue 5x. And I had not a board member, but another investor tell me that 7x was the gold standard now. Like, by the way, like never say that to anyone out loud. It's so ridiculous. But again, it was my first time through. And all I felt was, wow, I really respect and looked up to this person. And I was so proud of 5x. And I guess that's like only second best. Again, by the way, that company 7x was like Instacart or something. Like they don't even have the same business model. All that is to say, when we really got scaling and got bigger, we needed more experience and we were too slow to bring it in because partially I think we had great people that had been doing a great job so far. So I was hesitant to, bring somebody in over someone before they started failing. My co-founder and I had some differences of opinion about like how and when to bring in more senior people. I think there was a fear that senior people wouldn't actually be able to do hands-on work, which, by the way, can be true, but is not necessarily true. And we also didn't have like pressure from the outside. I actually really, really wish that some of our investors or our board had been like, Kathryn, you have an unbelievable opportunity with the growth you're seeing. I'm going to work with you to make sure we have all of the prior experience and the passion and the creativity and the hustle. But instead, I felt like I was sort of left to my own devices. And we also recruited executives one at a time. Lesson I learned, if you have a team that is less experienced and you're adding more experienced people, when you do it one at a time, it can sometimes be hard to get those people because being the first really seasoned person at a team without a ton of people have had the same professional background, I'm not sure that in some of those early searches we even had access. I also learned that a lot of the companies that I was, friends of mine who had companies in New York, their board members were like driving the search with them. Like the board member was calling the candidate and being like, hey, I know you don't want to leave your job. I know this, like you gotta look at this company. And we used a recruiter who I think were doing the best they could. Our board members were involved at the very end. But anyway, I could talk for an hour about all of the things that I learned during that first spate of hires. I'm happy to go deeper into any of it, but I think it's look, you don't want to change your whole leadership team. Like the people that built the company are there for a reason, and we successfully kept a lot of them. But I think when you're really scaling, a company needs a balance of figuring it out for the first time and been there, done that, can see around corners. And if you, the founder, are figuring it out for the first time, you got to have a couple people more than I think we had at the beginning that have been there, done that. If you really want to avoid some of the most obvious potholes, it's one thing when you make a mistake that nobody could have seen coming or the market changes. It's another when you do something and then later you're like, my gosh, anybody who's built a business before would have recognized these flashing caution signs.
That term that you said before, I really like it, is see around corners. I really like that because I think that's exactly, it's to your point. It's something that is going to be, it's there. And someone who's been around that corner 10 times, two times, one time, they will know that it's there and expect it there. And I think that is really important, is for me, when you start feeling like you have an entire executive team and no one knows what's around the corner, you're you're essentially guaranteeing that you're going to get surprised by what you find. Whereas even if a person, I think it's what you're saying, which is I found even if I hired an exec, let's call it a CRO, they could even identify what's going to be around the corner for the product, even if they're not in charge of the product, because at their other companies, they saw what happened to the product at scale. They saw what, so it's like, just to your point, just having a person around the table who can say, hey, have we thought of this? Or, hey, I think this could happen. It's really powerful to have that.
Yes, absolutely. And then, it's also helpful for gut checking. There were a couple times, because honestly, I have a really good intuition. There were a few times where I was like, I think that we're going to have a problem there. I think that this is maybe an issue. And the person in charge of that team would be like, no, it's fine. Or, I looked into it and I think it's totally fine. It turns out most of the time I was right, but A, I didn't have the conviction to push. I didn't want to be the micromanager that overruled. B, I was really acting on a hunch, not hardcore data. I think when you have folks that have been in the seat and have seen around corners, they can be like, you know what? Let's plug in this super experienced product leader that I know, have them take a quick look and give us a third opinion. They have access sometimes to expertise or resources that can validate or invalidate some of the either areas where two execs, one will say, this is not going right, we need to add a person or change a person or do something, and the other exec's like, hey, it's totally fine. How do you mediate those? Sometimes experience comes in really handy.
One thing you said before I want to go back to is when your investor said, oh, you grew 5x, but 7x is really the number. I had that experience with one of our investors over and over, and didn't matter what the metric was. It would be like, oh, we're doing 130% net retention. They're like, actually, what we really want to see is 140%. And then you'd say, oh, we grew 100%, and they'd say, oh, no, growing 200% at this scale is actually good. And what I learned over time is actually that they were taking the best metrics, not of one company, but of each company, putting it together and then saying you should grow 7x at 150% net retention with 100% gross retention, and they basically would and be profitable 20% EBITDA margin. And you're like, is that one company? And then when you dig deeper, it was the best of each of them. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, totally. And by the way, the best of each of them often in businesses that have literally nothing to do with yours. It's just, again, like our job here is not to police investor behavior, but I think it's one of the least helpful things that investors can do. And I cannot tell you the sass I'm going to give someone who tries to give me that in the future now that I know better. Like, I'm so not here for it.
When you think about your career and your growth, which obviously has been, you grew the business a lot, you grew yourself as a leader a lot. Did you have a mentor or a coach or a group that you were part of? Like, how did you evolve yourself as a CEO?
Yeah. I feel like I had a number of really incredible people along the way that helped. And by the way, I'm like a crazy reader. So I read, probably 15 different books on leadership, startups, CEOs. I had a coach almost the entire time that I was at the Muse. Not the same coach. I found that often I loved working with someone for like 1 to 2 years really intensely. And then sometimes it would be a good opportunity for me to change and find someone with a totally different style. Pros and cons, by the way. I have friends who've worked with the same coach, and I can see how that would be really valuable too. I also had a lot of really great kind of founder groups or other CEO groups. There's a group here in New York. Actually, it's not just in New York, but called The List that I was part of really early on, which was all women across tech and media. Not all founders, a variety of industries, but there were a number of women through that it had a kind of, it was a group that was very real. People were extremely open and honest with each other. And that I think is critical to learning, because most of learning is figuring out where you're fucking up. And it's hard to figure out where you might be off track or messing up if you're not really honest, if you're not talking to somebody who's going to be really honest about their challenges as well. So yeah, that was really helpful. I mean, I I really wish, looking back, that I'd had someone like me now who was embedded enough in the business. I think the challenge with some of the earlier coaches, which I would also potentially change, although maybe it would be less useful now that I'm have more experience. But I had a coach later, much later in the Muse's life, who actually spent time in our executive meetings and with some of my executives, and that was amazing because then when we were talking about the dynamics between two leaders, it wasn't just what I had told her about leader A and leader B. It was some of what she saw and some of what she'd experienced. And I would say for founders that are doing this for the first time, or CEOs that are doing this for the first time, if you do feel like you're like people radar, and sort of also what great looks like in a lot of different functions, your kind of ability to handle complex dynamics between very talented leaders with different agendas at times. If you feel really good about this, you don't need this piece of advice. But for those who are like I was, which was definitely recognizing that we needed more, I think if you can have somebody you trust who is, whether they're an advisor, an investor, or a coach, who's just one level deeper than just talking to you. Because when someone's just talking to you, your blind spots become their blind spots. You're not able usually to communicate to somebody something that you don't yet see yourself. And so I found that what got really helpful was, when I both had a coach that was able to do that, and then we brought in a really senior exec in 2019 who ended up kind of becoming, you know, COO, right hand, and that was unbelievably helpful. We had very different skill sets, but deep respect. And so we exchanged a lot of like feedback, different perspectives, and that was, I think, a huge growth area as well.
That the coach thing, that you just put into words something I've been feeling with the companies that I've been working with and advising. The ones where I get to meet the next level down, I am more effective for them. And to your point, the conversations also, you can almost gauge, is their radar good on talent? Is it not? But if you don't have that access, which some of the CEOs don't want, the coach to have that access or the advisor to have that access, it's a good point. You're basically just taking what the CEO says.
Totally. And I never had anybody offer it. All the coaches that I worked with, and for the most, I mean, my board members saw my execs present at the board level, but um, I think that like the first time a coach was like, if you want, I'd love to sit down with all your execs. I'd love to join a meeting. I can facilitate, some team building things for you. So it's not just like me sitting there watching you awkwardly. But she was like, I find it really helpful when I have a sense. And by the way, it's not that I always agreed. There'd be times when she'd be like, so and so seems like they're this. And I'm like, no, I strongly feel it's this. Cool, great. But it made me stronger to actually be talking to somebody with their own opinions. And I can totally see, like, if I were going to be investing in and advising companies in more depth, like I would want the next level down. And I think that that's how I can be most helpful to CEOs. That makes perfect sense to me that you're seeing that too.
Yeah. What was the biggest challenge you ever faced at the Muse, and how did you overcome that challenge?
Mm. I mean, there's so many to pick from. One that's maybe a little bit neater is just like raising funding in the beginning was unbelievably difficult. I said that number before, 148 rejections. But that was like 148, usually 45-minute to hour long meetings. Um, and that was individual funds or people who rejected me. So some of those came after 2, 3, 4 meetings. Psychologically, it was unbelievably difficult to just keep going to meetings after that much rejection. Physically, or like literally, it was difficult to find so many investors. I kept being like, well, gotta find more. And to how I got through it, I think there was a piece of it. So for the psychological piece, I found it really helpful to just re-ground myself and why I was doing what I was doing, which involved reading, at the time it was a lot of email and some social media response from users who were saying like, I can't believe I found this. I love this. This is so helpful. Even some of the critical emails, people would be like, this would be 20 times better if it did these things. And a lot of times it's like, yeah, those are all on the roadmap. There was very, very validating that we were building something people wanted. I also came to a recognition that the reasons our users were saying that they loved us were quite different from like the most of the investors I was talking to had a very successful career. I mean, they were literally venture capitalists or very successful angel investors. So most of them had gone to a great school, majored in something like finance or econ, gotten an MBA, done perhaps some sort of other job in finance, and then gone into venture. That isn't the archetype that the Muse was really good at serving. And so I had to totally change our pitch, because if I tried to say like, you would understand this, it was a complete failure. But when I started saying, imagine John or Jane, they're 25, they have this background, like really explicitly telling people who our user was, and then putting people in that mindset, that helped to get folks over the hump. I also just realized that we had to have traction. Nobody was going to fund this business unless I made it so undeniably clear that whether they got it or not, there was a need. And so I spent a huge amount of time on a variety of different we were just really both smart and lucky about how to get the Muse in front of our audience, how to partner with more established brands so that people heard about us. We had the luck part was partially that when people learned about the Muse, we were like first in category. So people told their friends, they passed the word around. We had a really good, virality didn't mean the same thing in 2012, but more or less that's what it was. And then I just, I went to a lot of tech meetups, and I also figured out if I met an investor for coffee for the first time, they were quite likely to say no. And in fact, many of them said things that were curious to me at the time. Like, sometimes it wasn't always this explicit, but they'd say things like, building a startup's really hard. You seem really nice. And essentially, I started to realize that when I met people for coffee, I was coming off as too sweet to fund, or whatever you would call it. Again, I was also 25, so 14, 13 years ago. When I met people for the first time after I pitched on stage, that's where I got my first 2 checks. And that was a huge thing. When I could go on stage at a startup competition or something else and be like, my name is Kathryn Minshew, this is my company, and this is why it matters. People were like, oh yeah, I think I might give you money. And so I started leaning into, how do I first do more of that? And then how do I bring that energy into my meetings as quickly as possible? Some of that was as simple as just meeting people at their offices instead of a coffee shop. Because at a coffee shop, there was oh, what do you want? Oh, should we sit here? Like, there's all these little social things that for whatever reason, I started to realize people were writing me off before I even opened my mouth about the business. But if I could start in a context where we started on the business, and I could give them like the one data point that would make them lean in, then I could keep them. I just had to not lose them before I had that chance.
So first of all, what I like about this is when I reflect on all my fundraising, and I think I got 100 rejections when I started fundraising, is if you're not, how do I say, if you're not emotional about it and you're instead using the lessons to get better and better, like you're describing, you actually get to a place where you become really good at the story and knowing. For me, you're like watching people's eyes when they light up, when they're nodding, and you start to remove the stuff that no one cares about, focus on the stuff that people do care, and you get really, really good. And a lot of founders that I talk to are fundraising, they only come back with the rejection, not, well, I got rejected, but I did have them for a little bit on this and this and this. And so what you're saying is kind of, it's that pattern. It's the repetition that essentially got you better and better until you really figured out the tone, even the setting, all of that.
Completely. In fact, there was a period of time in the early days where I learned that I had to tell people our user numbers before I told them what we did. It had to be the first thing. It couldn't even be the second thing. If I was like, the Muse is no, I had to be like, we're the Muse. 70,000 people use us a month. this is what we do. And that just switching the order, which by the way, it's not like the logical order to tell people about your business. It made a big difference because people decided that they cared first, and then they were listening for the details versus and by the way, when I talk to a lot of early stage entrepreneurs about fundraising, the other piece of advice I got, which I tend to think is really, I don't know, it was really great advice for me, is every business is being evaluated or could be evaluated on 5 dimensions. And you don't need to be 10 out of 10 on all of them, but you should try to be 10 out of 10 on one. And the dimensions are so your market. Sometimes you're doing something that's just so exciting. It's a market that people just want to be in, and like that can be amazing. That was never going to be the Muse. Sometimes it's your product, like when Uber first rolled out and you could push a button and a car would show up. Sometimes the literal technology blows people's minds. They're in. That was also not going to be the Muse, especially in the early days. Sometimes it's the team. Everybody sold businesses to, Google and Meta and whoever. Again, not us the first time. Sometimes it's your revenue and sometimes it's your users, user growth, user engagement. And so I was like, all right. So rather than like stressing about being like a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10 on these, let me just, yes, I'm going to do my best, but I'm really going to focus on what is the 1 or 2 data points that we can crush it and then make sure that is front and center. And again, plenty of people still say no, but at least I felt like I had, to your point, optimized what I was doing to give us the best possible chance.
So there was an investor who told me, one of my investors who told me, they said that they make a decision within 15 minutes or so of meeting the founder. They make the 15, 20 minutes, they make a decision of whether they want to invest or not. And then they spend the next however many months just validating the decision. But they made the decision very quickly. And it's a little like you're saying, which is they hear 70,000, they're like, whoa, I I have to understand what this company does. I'm really interested. And then the rest, they approach it in a more open-minded way. And they're now trying to validate, like, but I want to make sure I get access to the 70,000 users. I love that. Let me ask you quickly about Y Combinator. I have not been through Y Combinator. Was that worth it for you? Do you think that had a positive impact, or maybe an outsized positive impact for you and the business?
Yeah, I do. Was it perfect? No. We were in a batch with 66 companies, and I thought that was too many companies, and now I think it's nearly twice that. But I made some incredible friendships with other founders. There was just a regular process for sharing tremendous amounts of information. So I got the benefit of not just my reps, but all of the other founders that were sharing, like their reps as well. So there was definitely a bunch of the kind of early days mistakes that I didn't have to make personally because I was right up close to someone else who was making it and then dealing with the consequence. They were also helpful in so, for example, if you're a YC company, you get to post on Bookface. We found our first 2 or 3 engineers that way. We didn't need it forever, but it was really valuable in the beginning when when we were just starting out. I think you can approximate a lot of the benefits by getting like a kind of hands-on investor or like a really plugged-in startup community. A lot of the best things from YC we didn't get to continue to leverage because we moved back to New York. So that was I think if we had had some of those benefits on a longer basis, like you might if you have, again, like a great investor cohort where you live, like that could have been even better. But I think the stories as well of super successful founders who would come in and off the record tell the YC cohort about just like all the shit that went sideways. It's just great because honestly, I've never met a founder who doesn't have like 17 near-death experience stories, who doesn't sometimes wonder if they screwed it all up, are they doing it wrong? And I think there is a price to pay for founders who talk about that publicly because a lot of investors just want the overnight success, the super confident like leader. But I've been in rooms with people who tell those stories publicly and tell a very much realer, more honest story privately. And so I think just having that exposure early on, realizing that the founder journey is like hard for everyone, that was valuable. But again, we did not raise, and I think this is true. we did not raise a single dollar from the YC Demo Day audience. So 66 companies in our batch. We were, by the way, within our batch, we were considered one of the better companies. We had we had $20,000, I think, in revenue. And like most of the companies don't have any revenue at Demo Day. Again, 2012. We had like a pretty active user base. We had like a fairly developed product. And yeah, we pitched to 425 people, did not get a single one. But we just went back to just focusing on the fundamentals. And then 3 months later, when we had, doubled or tripled revenue and I think doubled or tripled our user base, that's when we got the round done. And a lot of it was actually people in New York who were like, I've been following you. I know I said no in March. I wasn't ready, but yeah, you're doing it. So we're in.
So I want to transition a little bit more to your background in a second, but before I do that, so you exited the Muse. You've taken some time. We'll get to some more of the details there. But what what do you think you're going to do next? Do you think you're going to go back and operate again? You think you'll start a company? You think you'll where do you have I think a lot of people are waiting to find out. So I'm going to see if you'll tell me, today, or you can tell me you
Live
don't know.
breaking news on this podcast. No, I gotta give the same answer because it's true that I'm giving to everyone who asks me, which is I know I'll found a company again, but I don't know when. I don't have a thing that I'm in love with yet. And honestly, part of me wishes I had it by now. Like I have so many amazing people that I know that I like would love to work with if I had the right thing to work with them on. I miss like waving the banner of a cause or a thing that I think should be different about the world. I love that, and I miss that. And starting a business is intense. It's grueling. I'm loving advising companies, so that's been something that's like taking up some time. I'm on Intro, which is one of these platforms where people can like book your time. It's an experiment, but I've been meeting people that I never would have, chatted with otherwise. So that's been fun. Doing a little bit of like consulting work for big corporate to see what that's like and kind of merge some of the tech startup digital lessons. It's an interesting opportunity to also learn how a very different class of business does things on the inside. Also thinking about maybe writing another book. But I've been really enjoying the flexibility of this time, and something's going to pull me out of it, but it's got to have to be a pretty amazing thing. I'm also getting all these like cool job offers. I don't know. Like, I don't think I'm going to take like a normal job, but every now and then someone's like, you want to be CEO of this thing? I'm like, I'll take a look. And then usually the answer is like, no, thanks though. But I'm actually trying to very intentionally, because you get so few opportunities in life to just throw the doors open. I'm really intentionally trying to let go of ideas about what I should do next and just like explore. And part of that means like picking up interesting things that come across my radar, even if they like might look a little unusual, and being like, is it this? And again, usually it's like, no, but thank you. But I'm loving the process, and some of those companies I end up advising or helping in other ways. And yeah, we'll see. I mean, sooner or later, I got to figure it out, but I guess you can't rush inspiration, even if you want to sometimes.
I like it. Let's talk about your background. Where are you from originally?
So born in Dallas, Texas, moved to Los Angeles when I was 10, and then Washington, D.C. suburbs when I was 11. So I kind of consider home to be Northern Virginia outside of D.C. because that's where I did 6th grade, middle school, high school. My parents still live there, but I also have a lot of family in Texas. So, and it's actually very useful. They're very different parts of the country, and I feel like I have a sort of a toehold in both.
Did you grow up in an entrepreneurial family? Did you see that at like a young age and say, I want to be a CEO one day? Like where did the entrepreneurial spirit come from?
I think the entrepreneurial spirit was definitely alive in my family. My dad was an entrepreneur at times, in between times of, working he's an engineer by training. So he worked for Texas Instruments. He did both a combination of like the more corporate traditional job and then times of starting his business. Funnily enough, I actually grew up hating business, and it wasn't obviously like business. I think I just hated, I felt like there was a lot of stress in my dad's life. And I remember once he was talking to me about business and I was like, don't you know I hate business? Just hilarious because honestly, I love business. Like I'm the person that, goes to like get a massage and I'm like, I wonder what's the cost breakdown of my massage payment into rent and, the body worker and all the different things. So I freaking love business, but it took me a while to realize it. I will say when I was in the 8th grade, so about 13 or so, I really loved theater, like I said before, and my school only did 2 plays a year. And I was like, well, I want to put on more plays, but if I do my own plays, they're probably not going to be as good as the ones that the school does. And how am I going to get an audience? If I just put them on like for the community, it's just going to be a pity audience. It'll be like family members of the cast and probably won't be that good. Who would actually like seeing a bunch of 13-year-olds perform plays that are probably going to be kind of good, but not that good? And I was like, I know, kids and senior citizens. So I started a theater group and we went around to all of the senior citizens' homes in the area and then like libraries, children's festivals. We ended up performing at Duke Children's Hospital years later to like, I don't even know, 200 or 300 kids. But yeah, I started a theater troupe and it was a nonprofit. It wasn't even registered as a nonprofit. It was like a thing. But I look back and I think a lot of the roots, and my parents were super supportive. They would take me to the thrift store to get princess dresses so we could do, Cinderella and, help me. Like I sewed costumes for like, run as fast as you can. You can't catch me. I'm the gingerbread man. And it was honestly so fun. And partially it's because like 8-year-olds really did think our stuff was great. And, like people that were, older people that were in some of the homes in my area, like they loved having our troupe visit. And I knew it wasn't just like a pity watch. And actually the last thing I'll say on that is there were a few times I gathered all of, my friends who were in this theater troupe to go put on a show at a library and they had forgotten to promote it. And there were like 3 kids in the audience and like 14 people on stage. That's super embarrassing. But I think it was also a useful preparation for entrepreneurship because it does not, in fact, kill you. You can be mortified, but you're not dead and you're actually just fine after your friends all make a lot of fun of you. So anyway, I think it was like a really good early set of lessons in, what do audiences want, how to serve them, how to survive devastating failure, how to do a lot with a little, all that stuff.
What was your first job ever? Like your first job out of school?
Oh, I was gonna say, well, my first job ever was a lifeguard. And then I was promoted to assistant manager in my local regional swimming pool, $6.15 an hour. It's really earning the big bucks. My first proper job was working at McKinsey. So I thought I was going to go into the foreign service. And in 2007, I spent a couple months at a U.S. embassy in Cyprus in the Mediterranean with a secret level clearance and like doing the job I thought I wanted. Very grateful for that experience because I realized it wasn't it. And so McKinsey was kind of the place to go when you didn't know what you wanted. The path I thought I wanted wasn't right. And so I did 2 years there while I was like trying to figure it out, I guess.
One of the things you introduced me to is investing in Broadway and investing in shows, which I had never done before, and it sounds like you've done quite a bit of that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Have you always been doing that? Is that something just since you exited the Muse? Like, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's newer. I've loved theater since I was a kid and always had friends who were in the arts. But for me, the idea of investing in Broadway, I thought was like a way distant future pipe dream, someday when I'm older and really rich. And then actually, it was about 2 years ago. There was a show coming to Broadway called Parade, which ended up winning the Tony last season for Best Musical Revival 2023. But it's this really beautiful story about, I was going to say beautiful and like very hard story about a real incident from, I think, around 1920, where a young woman is found murdered. There's a factory owner who is sort of convicted essentially because he's Jewish and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so the musical deals with a lot of themes of like discrimination, racism, anti-Semitism, tolerance, the media, their role in, in sort of public understanding and also inciting mobs. Anyway, I was really fascinated. It was coming to Broadway, and someone invited me to invest. And another friend said, well, if you don't want to do a whole investment chunk yourself, which typical Broadway minimums are about $25,000. And that was both, frankly, a lot of money for me to write a single check. I didn't know Broadway. I also assumed, like, what if I lose all this money? A friend said, if you don't want to write that check yourself, what if a couple of us come together? I'll do the paperwork to create a little LLC and we can invest in it in smaller fractions. It's kind of like an SPV for tech. And so I ended up going in with Alex, who I co founded The Muse with, our friend Christina, and another woman. And we wrote together one unit into Parade. And, it was a little bit of a flyer. I was like, I hope this works, but it's also a small enough bet that I'm willing to learn. And luckily, that was an amazing show. It did well. It returned more than we put in. It won the Tony. And I just loved it too. There's something about seeing a show when you're actually involved that is amazing. So then, I got bitten. I started seeing more shows. I started kind of watching a lot of the data that's publicly available and also gathering some private data. Once I left The Muse, I had more time. So I was asked if I wanted to co-produce first a musical called Water for Elephants. Then I signed up on Suffs is like, oh my gosh, definitely if you're listening to this, see Suffs. It's a musical about the women's suffrage movement and women getting the right to vote. That's incredibly powerful. Water for Elephants, also a fantastic show, like beautiful circus. We came on for Cabaret. And now this fall, I'm doing Romeo and Juliet, which is opening. I think the first preview is tomorrow. Actually, there's a invited dress rehearsal tonight that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to make. But I just think, like, I don't know. I look for art that I think is both like that I want to be made. Like there's something that it's saying or it's doing that that is powerful or emotionally resonant in some way. And then also shows that can be commercially successful. Now, Broadway is kind of like tech. 7 out of 10 Broadway investments don't return the full amount. 1 or 2 will return like a single, a double, maybe a triple. And then 1 out of 10 can like return the fund. So if you invest in Hamilton or Wicked or something, my rough understanding, without citing kind of specific numbers, that if you invested something like $25,000 in one of those shows, you're getting like millions of dollars out. And because shows run for a long time, investors actually just get checks on an ongoing basis from that show as it continues to run. If you invest in an original production and it's very successful, you also get checks from any touring productions, any follow-on regional productions, even high school theater productions will pay small royalties back to the original mothership. And so it's a really fascinating industry. And I love it. I mean, I don't want it to be my next thing. That was a useful realization through this work, but I'm already signed up for both Romeo and Juliet, which is coming, like I said, I think opening night is in October, but it's coming soon. A large part of that run is already sold out because it's got some really hot stars in it, and people are buying those tickets early, which is amazing. And then looking at a bunch of new shows, looking at some stuff really early where it's maybe a couple years from Broadway, but they need help just kind of guiding the show through some of the earlier stages. And it's been a really, really fascinating and fun way to apply my tech and startup skills. And so the organization, by the way, that I started to do this is called Nothing Ventured Productions. It's 3 of us, Alex Kavalakis, Christina Wallace, and myself. We have a nice little website where people can check it out. But yeah, it's like, it's a side thing for all of us, but I don't know. It's really fun and fun bringing other people in.
Yeah, well, you got me. You sent me the offer for Romeo and Juliet, and we invested, and I'm so excited. I get all the notes. I'm excited. I like Broadway shows in general, but when you're invested in it, it's like a completely different level. And I'm checking the Instagram, and I'm looking at the, and when you get the projections, it's a. I mean, it's like any business, obviously, but it's been a lot of fun actually to go through the process. And So yeah, I love that. Um, Let me ask you last question, which is knowing everything you know today, your entire experience at the Muse, at McKinsey, everything you've done. If you could go back all the way to the beginning before you came out of school and give yourself one piece of advice, what would that be?
The one that's coming to mind is just like, it's all gonna be okay. I think that, and and it doesn't mean, by the way, that I got what I wanted. In fact, like, I had crushing failure. I started a company before the Muse. That was essentially the Muse B0 with my Muse co-founder and two other women, and it exploded in a painful ball of flames, otherwise known as a co-founder dispute. And I spent 3 weeks in the fetal position. The way that the Muse ended, there are things about that I wish I could change. With we brought in a private equity firm, and at the same point, like, I think, like, I wish I could just be like, you're gonna be okay. And if we're getting more tactical, I think probably should have hired a COO earlier. that's that's high on my tactical list. But I think the lessons are part of it. So yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna marinate on that.
No, it's going to be okay. I think is a really important thing for founders to hear, because there are days where it feels like, especially when it's your company, it's your whole world for most founders. And so, I think that's excellent. I love that advice. It's a good way to end this episode. If people want to connect with you, let's say they want your help, they want to connect, advisory, consulting, just connecting. What's the best platform or the best way to connect with you?
Yeah, a couple ways. I have a website, which is just kminshew.com. I think there's like a way to send me an email through that. Um, I check my Instagram DMs like fairly frequently, definitely not every day. Um, you can add me on LinkedIn, just Kathryn Minshew. And I would say, yeah, I'm not on X so much anymore. Although I do occasionally check those too, but I get a lot of random weird inbound. So I would say, like, my website or LinkedIn or Instagram, probably the way to go.
Awesome. Kathryn, thank you for doing this with me. I think there was a lot in here that people can learn from, and I think especially, first time founders, some of the lessons you learned and shared can change someone's journey. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think it's awesome that you're doing this. It's exactly what I wish I had had. So I love it. I'm happy to be here, and yeah, just really appreciate everybody tuning in.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, like, subscribe, share with your networks, and we'll see you for the next episode of Not Another CEO Podcast. That's a wrap for this week's episode of Not Another CEO Podcast. Thanks for joining. For show notes and more, please visit notanotherceopodcast.com. We'll see you next week.